When completing the work provided during week 2 of the module, we took a particular interest in the controversies surrounding Edward Colston, especially the contrast of his role as the great Bristol philanthropist, funding the construction of schools and libraries and making donations to many Bristol charities, while simultaneously implementing pain and immense suffering through the slave trade. This interest was exacerbated by our experience of living through the Black Lives Matter movement, with some members of our group attending protests similar to the ones that resulted in the toppling of the Colston statue. When we arrived in Bristol for our field trip, we headed straight for the plinth that Colston's statue previously stood on, as it was the focal point of the Black Lives Matter protests and one of the most notable artefacts of our lived experience. Having studied the plinth and observed the reactions of the public around it, we then followed the path along which Colston's statue was rolled, retracing the steps of the BLM protesters. This led us to the floating harbour that Colston's statue was historically submerged in last June and where he once traded slaves from. We then decided to follow the route of the virtual walking tour around the floating harbour we watched in week 4, starting at Perry's Bridge, in order to answer the question of which parts of the floating harbour were related to slavery. This led us past the Shed Museum, via the historic dock railways, ending at the SS Great Britain.
Outside the SS Great Britain, we encountered some display boards erected by the museum, providing information about the ship itself and the wider role of Bristol as a port city. While studying these, a museum employee dressed as Isambard Kingdom Brunel approached us. Through our conversation with him, we discovered there was a man called Christopher Claxton who had worked with Brunel on the SS Great Britain, Great Western, and the Great Western Railway, providing money towards these projects, which had originated in slave money. He also told us about Thomas Guppy, who had also helped to fund Brunel's key infrastructure projects. We decided we wanted to learn more about the impact of slave money in Bristol and consequently returned to the week 3 content, reading Madge Dresser's book, Slavery Obscured, to ask whether there was a strong link between slave money and infrastructure in Bristol. Through reading this, we discovered that the slave trade led to an urban renaissance in Bristol, incurring significant development in the city of Bristol, especially in regards to the city's infrastructure. We learned that this was because many Bristol merchants were either using their profits made from their families' slave plantations or were receiving large sums of money framed as compensation later in time during the 1830s, when slavery was abolished, to fund these architectural projects. Having established a strong link between slave money and infrastructure in Bristol, we followed the leads that the museum employee provided and set to work asking how Christopher Claxton's money had shaped Brunel's work. In reading extracts from Slaves to Sleepers by Toni Morrison, we discovered that Claxton had gained his wealth from his family's plantations in St. Kitts and Nevis. Throughout his career, he was very politically active, speaking openly about his positive views towards slavery and publicly opposed those who were attempting to campaign for the abolition of such practices, even sometimes threatening physical violence. Claxton was harbour master in Bristol when he became acquainted with Brunel, who was early on in his career at the time, and became an advisory figure to him. He used his own money to fund Brunel's shipbuilding in Bristol Harbour and thus became secretary of the Great Western Steamship Company. Whilst this was very interesting, Claxton didn't lead us to any other key figures in the funding of Brunel's work. We still wanted to ask how Brunel's work had been shaped by slave money, so we began our own reading and research and turned our attention to Thomas Guppy.
An initial Google search on Thomas Guppy confirmed Brunel's assertions that Guppy had helped to fund Brunel's projects. We discovered that he had gained his wealth from his family's sugar and copper businesses, which both traded through the slave trade, as well as using slaves for labour, through reading a 2018 article in the Western Daily Press. Specifically, we found that Guppy had helped fund the SS Great Western, the SS Great Britain, and the Great Western Railway. Through the same article, it also transpired that through Guppy's personal and family wealth derived from the slave trade, he was high up in Bristol's social scene and had access to key investors such as George Gibbs, whom he encouraged to invest in Brunel's work. Having discovered George Gibbs through Thomas Guppy, we decided to research him and ask how he had funded Brunel's work, by looking at the Legacies of British Slavery website. This informed us that he had gained his wealth through the slave trade and had made 3 successful compensation claims under the 1837 Slavery Compensation Act. He used this money to help fund the Bristol Dock and Canal Company, the Great Western Steamship Company, and the Great Western Railway. His investment in the Great Western Railway was specifically £5,000 in the Portbury Railway, which formed part of the Great Western Railway linking Bristol to this port town. Once we were aware of the link between slave money and the Great Western Railway, we decided to research the history behind other investors in order to ask what the prominence of this connection was. This led us to look at the Great Western Railway's page on the Legacies of British Slavery website, through which we found Thomas Daniel, a Bristolian merchant known as the King of Bristol, who made 30 successful claims under the 1837 Slavery Compensation Act, earning vast wealth from his plantations in the West Indies. Some of this money was then invested into the Great Western Railway. He was involved in a diverse range of projects in Bristol, not just related to architecture, such as being the co-founder of the Bristol and West England Zoological Society, a partner in the Bristol Old Bank, and was on the committee for the construction of the Clifton Suspension Bridge. He was also Mayor of Bristol from 1797 to 1798.
If we were to delve deeper into this rabbit hole, we could research further how Bristol evolved and developed as a direct result of the transport infrastructure supplied using slave money. This could be done by accessing historic records and archives on trade and population size and movement. For example, via the History Data Service collection, and comparing records from before and after the construction of the Great Western Railway to quantify the impact it had on Bristol's demographics. If we were to visit Bristol again, we could also revisit the M-Shed with a clear focus on their transportation section to see what else we could find in order to answer the question of how slave money shaped Brunel's work in Bristol. In following this route of inquiry, we have deepened and improved our knowledge and understanding of how slave money shaped transport infrastructure worked on by Brunel. We began by exploring the lecture material from week 2 and 3, which led us to Colston as a key slave trader and philanthropist. This led us to the plinth where his statue once stood, and from there to the floating harbour, where his statue was dumped during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. From there, we followed the route of the walking tour that we watched in week 4. And this led us past Perrow's Bridge, the M-Shed, and across the historic Dockside Railway until we reached the SS Great Britain, where a museum employee approached us and informed us of the links between Brunel and 2 men, Claxton and Guppy. We then returned to the academic reading provided in week 3 to look deeper into the link between slave money and infrastructure in Bristol. Intrigued by this rabbit hole, we researched the 2 men the employee at the museum had mentioned. We read an ebook and newspaper article to research Claxton and Guppy respectively. This led us to discover Daniel and Gibbs and their influence in Brunel's work. Lastly, we would develop this further by reviewing archive data in relation to the Great Western Railway and SS Great Britain and Great Western, as well as revisiting the M-Shed with a clear focus on the transportation section.